She entered the wartime landscape already armored by expectation, carrying within her a version of the future that had been carefully shaped by rumor, warning, and fear. Long before she encountered the reality of occupation and authority, she had rehearsed it internally, imagining the tone of voices, the sharpness of orders, the inevitability of humiliation. This preparation was not dramatic or defiant. It was quiet and methodical, an internal tightening meant to prevent collapse when the moment finally arrived. In a world increasingly governed by forces beyond individual control, anticipation became her only form of agency. She believed that if she expected cruelty, she would not be undone by it. Her understanding of the enemy was not rooted in personal grievance but in collective storytelling. Newspapers, whispered conversations, official notices, and second-hand accounts had merged into a single, simplified image of what awaited her: severity without explanation, discipline stripped of empathy, authority exercised as punishment rather than necessity. These stories did not need to be consistent to be effective. They only needed to repeat. Over time, repetition hardened into certainty. She accepted this image not because she enjoyed it, but because doubting it felt dangerous. Hope, under such conditions, seemed like an indulgence she could not afford. The war had already taught her that softness invited harm. Shortages had demanded adaptation, air raids had demanded composure, and loss had demanded silence. Each lesson reinforced the same conclusion: survival required restraint, emotional economy, and vigilance. To expect kindness was to risk being shattered by disappointment. To remain open was to expose oneself to forces that did not pause for individual vulnerability. She learned, as many did, to narrow her emotional range, to reduce surprise, to treat the future as a hostile environment best approached with caution. In preparing herself for harshness, she was not imagining herself as a hero or a victim, but as someone enduring a necessary trial. This endurance carried a moral weight. To withstand cruelty without breaking was, in its own way, a form of resistance. She believed that by refusing to expect mercy, she was refusing to grant the enemy any power over her inner life. Emotional self-denial became an act of dignity, a way of preserving something essential even if everything else was taken away. Her anticipation of severity also reflected a broader wartime logic that divided the world into clear categories. There were sides, roles, and behaviors assigned in advance. One did not need to know individuals to know what they represented. Uniforms replaced personalities, accents replaced intentions. In such a framework, complexity was not only inconvenient but destabilizing. Moral clarity depended on distance, and distance depended on abstraction. She did not question this logic because questioning it would require confronting uncertainty at a time when certainty felt like the only stable ground. Yet beneath this hardened surface, there remained a quieter undercurrent of fear, one she rarely allowed herself to examine. It was not simply fear of physical harm, though that was real enough, but fear of being wrong in her preparations. If she misjudged the nature of what was coming, she would not only suffer materially but morally, having shaped herself in anticipation of a cruelty that might arrive in an unexpected form. Still, she pushed this thought aside. The cost of being overly guarded, she reasoned, was preferable to the cost of being unprepared. Her emotional discipline mirrored the physical discipline demanded by wartime life. Rationing taught her to measure desire, blackouts taught her to live with imposed darkness, and curfews taught her to surrender autonomy without protest. These conditions normalized restraint, making it easier to extend the same logic inward. She practiced stillness, cultivated a neutral expression, and trained herself to listen more than speak. These habits were not signs of submission but strategies, ways of conserving energy for whatever might come. She also carried with her the inherited memories of earlier conflicts, stories passed down that framed occupation as a time of unrelenting severity. These memories were rarely precise, but their emotional tone was unmistakable. They spoke of authority exercised through fear, of arbitrary punishment, of dignity eroded slowly through daily indignities. Whether these stories were accurate mattered less than their cumulative effect. They formed a psychological blueprint that shaped how she imagined her own future under foreign control. In this mental rehearsal, She imagined herself becoming smaller, quieter, more rigid. She expected to be watched, corrected, and constrained. She expected her inner life to become a private refuge, sealed off from the external world. This expectation was not entirely pessimistic. It carried with it a grim confidence. She believed she could endure hardness because she had already accepted it. By acknowledging the worst in advance, she hoped to rob it of its power to surprise her. The landscape of war reinforced this mindset. Buildings bore scars, streets carried an unnatural stillness, and the rhythm of daily life had been reshaped by threat. Nothing in this environment suggested gentleness. Everything pointed toward endurance, control, and suppression. She read the world around her as confirmation of what she already believed, that harshness was not an aberration but the natural language of wartime authority. And so, when the moment of encounter approached, she felt not fear but a steady resolve. She did not expect fairness, understanding, or compassion. She expected rules, enforcement, and emotional distance. This expectation became a form of psychological insulation, a way of limiting the damage that could be done to her sense of self. She would comply outwardly, resist inwardly, and survive somewhere between the two. What she did not yet understand was how profoundly this preparation would shape her reaction to anything that deviated from it. By bracing herself so completely for cruelty, she had left no space for contradiction. Her moral framework was rigid not because she was inflexible by nature, but because flexibility felt like exposure. The war had taught her to value predictability over truth, endurance over understanding. At this stage, her story is defined not by what has happened, but by what she believes is inevitable. She stands at the threshold of experience carrying a carefully constructed vision of the enemy, a vision designed to protect her but also to confine her. The harshness she anticipates is already doing its work, shaping her expectations, narrowing her emotional range, and preparing her for a world she believes will offer no softness in return. The encounter does not unfold as she had rehearsed it. Instead of the sharp commands and theatrical severity she had prepared herself to absorb, the arrival of British authority is marked by an almost unsettling calm. Movements are deliberate rather than aggressive, procedures followed with a quiet exactness that lacks spectacle. There is no immediate attempt to intimidate through volume or excess force. The atmosphere is controlled, but not explosive, disciplined without appearing vengeful. This alone disrupts the internal script she has been carrying, the one that told her to expect hostility as the dominant language of power. What strikes her first is not kindness in the sentimental sense, but restraint. Orders are given plainly, without embellishment. Boundaries are enforced, yet explained through routine rather than threat. The men in uniform do not seem eager to assert themselves through humiliation or fear, and this absence feels almost suspicious. She searches their faces for signs of contempt, for the cold satisfaction she has been told accompanies occupation, but finds instead expressions shaped by habit and duty. They appear less like conquerors reveling in dominance and more like functionaries managing an unwanted burden. This restraint creates a dissonance that unsettles her more than cruelty might have. Harshness would have confirmed her expectations, allowing her emotional armor to function as intended. Gentleness, however limited or procedural, bypasses those defenses entirely. It introduces ambiguity into a situation she had believed would be morally straightforward. She finds herself uncertain how to respond, unsure whether to interpret this behavior as genuine or strategic, temporary or calculated. The lack of overt hostility leaves her without a clear emotional posture. The British presence carries with it a particular cultural texture, one that feels foreign yet oddly familiar. There is an emphasis on orderliness, on cues and schedules, on rules applied evenly rather than arbitrarily. Even under conditions of scarcity and tension, there is an insistence on formality. Politeness surfaces in unexpected places, not as warmth, but as a social reflex that persists even when circumstances might seem to make it irrelevant. This politeness feels almost out of place amid the damaged buildings and anxious silences of wartime life. She had expected power to announce itself loudly, to dominate space through fear. Instead, it occupies space quietly, asserting control through consistency rather than shock. This does not make it benign, but it makes it harder to categorize. Authority that does not scream or strike immediately challenges the simple moral geometry she has relied upon. It forces her to acknowledge that domination can wear many faces, some of them disturbingly composed. As the days progress, small interactions accumulate. A procedure carried out without unnecessary cruelty. A rule enforced without personal malice. A moment where her presence is acknowledged without disdain. None of these acts are dramatic, and that is precisely what gives them their power. They erode her expectations gradually, not through a single transformative event, but through repetition. Each restrained encounter chips away at the certainty she once held, replacing it with questions she had not allowed herself to ask. She becomes acutely aware of her own reactions, noticing how her body remains tense even when no immediate threat materializes. Her mind continues to brace for impact that does not come. This constant readiness begins to feel exhausting, disproportionate to the reality she is facing. The emotional energy she has conserved for cruelty now has nowhere to go, and it turns inward, manifesting as confusion rather than fear. This confusion is dangerous, she knows. War rewards clarity, not nuance. To misinterpret the enemy is to risk vulnerability. Yet she cannot ignore what she is observing. The British gentleness, however limited, complicates the moral narrative she has relied upon for stability. It forces her to confront the possibility that her understanding of the war, and of those enforcing its rules, has been incomplete. She does not mistake this restraint for friendship or solidarity. The imbalance of power remains undeniable. She is still subject to regulations she did not choose, still living under constraints imposed by a foreign authority. But the manner in which these constraints are applied matters more than she expected. It alters the emotional texture of occupation, transforming it from a constant state of terror into a more ambiguous condition marked by tension rather than outright fear. This ambiguity creates an internal conflict. Part of her resents the disruption of her expectations, feeling that this gentleness undermines the emotional clarity she worked so hard to construct. Another part of her, quieter but persistent, feels a reluctant relief. It recognizes that survival under restraint is less corrosive than survival under brutality. Yet even this relief is tinged with guilt, as though acknowledging it risks betraying those who suffered under harsher forms of control elsewhere. She begins to understand that propaganda had not simply exaggerated the enemy's cruelty, but flattened their humanity into a single, convenient shape. What she is encountering now is not kindness in a redemptive sense, but complexity. Individuals operating within a system, adhering to cultural norms that prize composure and understatement even in contexts where violence might seem expected. This realization does not absolve the system itself, but it complicates her emotional response to it. Moments of enforced order reveal an unexpected fairness. Rules apply regardless of personal appeal, but they also apply regardless of personal hostility. This impartiality feels strange, even unsettling, to someone who expected arbitrariness as a tool of domination. She had braced herself for humiliation, for the erosion of dignity through petty cruelty. Instead, dignity is challenged in quieter ways, through loss of autonomy rather than loss of respect. The absence of overt cruelty does not make the situation easier to endure, but it makes it harder to resist emotionally. Anger, when not constantly provoked, loses some of its urgency. Hatred, without constant reinforcement, becomes more difficult to sustain. She finds herself inhabiting a psychological middle ground, one where resentment coexists with reluctant acknowledgement. This space is uncomfortable, offering neither the moral certainty of victimhood nor the relief of reconciliation. She notices, too, how this gentleness affects the broader atmosphere. Tension remains, but panic does not dominate every interaction. People move cautiously rather than desperately. Life does not resume its former shape, but it does not collapse entirely. This partial stability feels almost unnatural in wartime, as though the world is holding its breath rather than screaming. For her, the most unsettling aspect is how this experience forces her to reconsider the purpose of her emotional armor. She had believed that hardness was necessary to survive, that emotional withdrawal was a form of protection. Yet now she wonders whether this armor has also limited her ability to perceive reality accurately. By preparing exclusively for cruelty, she may have blinded herself to other forms of power, subtler but equally influential. The British gentleness does not resolve the moral tension of occupation, it intensifies it. It removes the comfort of simple opposition and replaces it with a landscape of contradictions. Authority exercised without overt brutality raises questions about responsibility, complicity, and choice. It suggests that systems can function smoothly even when they are unjust, and that suffering does not always announce itself loudly. By the end of this phase, she has not softened toward her occupiers, but she has been changed by the encounter. The certainty she once carried has been replaced by vigilance of a different kind, one that watches not only for violence but for inconsistency between expectation and reality. She is no longer preparing herself solely for harshness. She is learning, unwillingly, to navigate a world where gentleness and control can exist side by side, and where moral clarity is far more fragile than she once believed. Time stretches the initial shock into a slow, grinding realization. What first appeared as isolated moments of restraint now reveals itself as a pattern, steady and persistent. Days pass without the eruption of the cruelty she had anticipated, and this continuity forces her to confront the possibility that what she is witnessing is not an exception but a norm. The British presence settles into the rhythms of daily life, embedding itself not through spectacle but through routine. Authority becomes something encountered repeatedly in small, almost mundane ways, and it is precisely this ordinariness that begins to unsettle her most deeply. She starts to notice details she once would have dismissed as irrelevant. The way procedures are followed even when no one is watching. The absence of arbitrary punishment. The insistence on structure not as a performance of dominance, but as a method of control that relies on predictability. These observations accumulate quietly, each one undermining a little more of the rigid emotional framework she constructed before the encounter. Her defenses, designed to repel brutality, find nothing solid to push against. This gradual erosion creates an internal strain. Her mind had been organized around a simple moral alignment, one that allowed her to conserve emotional energy by categorizing the world into threats and responses. Now that alignment no longer holds. The enemy behaves in ways that do not match the category she assigned to them, and this mismatch demands constant recalibration. She feels herself becoming mentally fatigued, worn down not by fear but by the effort of maintaining coherence in a world that refuses to conform to expectation. She begins to question her own instincts. The vigilance she once trusted now feels misdirected, like a weapon raised against an absent blow. Yet she cannot lower it entirely. War has taught her that patterns can change without warning, that restraint today does not guarantee restraint tomorrow. Suspicion remains, but it has lost its sharpness. It no longer feels like a clear-eyed survival strategy, but like a habit struggling to justify itself. In moments of quiet, she reflects on how easily she had accepted the idea that cruelty was inevitable. That assumption had offered a strange comfort, a sense of preparation that felt like control. Letting go of it means admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty feels dangerous. If the world is not as harsh as she believed, then she must confront the fact that she shaped herself in anticipation of suffering that may never arrive in the form she expected. This realization carries a subtle grief, a mourning for the emotional self she constructed and now finds unnecessary. The British restraint begins to function as a mirror, reflecting back her own rigidity. She becomes aware of how tightly she holds herself, how reluctant she is to respond naturally to moments that invite something other than fear. Even neutrality feels difficult. Her expressions remain guarded, her posture defensive, as though she is waiting for permission to relax that never comes. The war has trained her body as much as her mind, and unlearning that training proves far more difficult than she imagined. Small gestures continue to challenge her expectations. Not gestures of intimacy or warmth, but of basic human acknowledgement. A glance that recognizes her presence without judgment. An interaction conducted without contempt. These moments are fleeting and easily overlooked, yet they linger in her memory because they contradict the narrative she relied upon. Each one introduces a new question. If this is possible here, what else might she have misunderstood? She resists the implications of these questions. To accept them too readily feels like a betrayal of those who suffered under harsher regimes, of stories she carries from others whose experiences were defined by violence and degradation. She fears that recognizing gentleness where she finds it might diminish the reality of brutality elsewhere. This internal conflict sharpens her sense of isolation, placing her between inherited memory and lived experience, uncertain which deserves greater authority. As this tension grows, she becomes more aware of the emotional cost of sustaining hatred without constant reinforcement. Hatred, she realizes, requires energy. It thrives on repetition and confirmation. In the absence of daily provocation, it begins to thin, not disappearing entirely but losing its intensity. This does not bring relief so much as disorientation. Anger had provided clarity, a clear direction for her emotions. Without it, she feels unmoored, uncertain where to direct her resentment or how to justify it to herself. She also observes how others around her adapt. Some remain rigid, clinging to suspicion regardless of circumstance. Others appear to soften, not in allegiance but in demeanor, adjusting their behavior to the reality they face rather than the one they were promised. These differences reveal how individual survival strategies diverge under the same conditions. She recognizes herself in both responses, caught between resistance and adaptation, unsure which path preserves more of her integrity. The British authority, meanwhile, continues its work with quiet consistency. There is no grand attempt to win hearts, no overt display of benevolence. Control remains firm, boundaries clear. Yet the absence of cruelty becomes, paradoxically, a form of pressure. It denies her the moral simplicity of absolute opposition. It forces her to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that systems of domination do not always rely on terror to function effectively. Sometimes they operate through compliance, habit, and the gradual normalization of constraint. This realization unsettles her deeply. She had believed that injustice would always announce itself loudly, that suffering would always be unmistakable. Instead, she begins to see how easily life can continue under conditions that are fundamentally unfair, how dignity can be preserved in form while autonomy is stripped away in substance. The gentleness she encounters does not negate the reality of occupation. It disguises it, making it harder to name and therefore harder to resist. She turns inward, examining her own responses with increasing scrutiny. Why does restraint disarm her more than brutality? Why does politeness feel more destabilizing than threat? The answers are not flattering. She recognizes that cruelty would have allowed her to maintain a clear sense of moral superiority, to endure suffering with righteous anger. Gentleness complicates that stance, forcing her to confront her own adaptability, her capacity to normalize what she once believed she would never accept. This capacity frightens her. It suggests that survival may require compromises she is not ready to acknowledge, that resilience can blur into accommodation. She worries that by adjusting to this reality, she risks losing something essential, some internal line that defines who she is. Yet she also knows that refusing to adjust carries its own cost, one measured in constant tension and emotional exhaustion. Over time, the internal recalibration becomes unavoidable. She does not abandon her skepticism, but she refines it. Instead of expecting overt cruelty, she learns to watch for subtler forms of control. Instead of bracing for violence, she braces for erosion, of autonomy, of certainty, of moral clarity. This shift marks a profound change in how she understands power. It is no longer a blunt instrument but a pervasive presence, shaping behavior through routine rather than fear. The gentleness she encounters thus becomes a catalyst rather than a comfort. It forces her to confront the limitations of the narratives she inherited and the strategies she built upon them. It reveals that survival in wartime is not only a matter of endurance, but of interpretation, of constantly reassessing the meaning of what one experiences. She begins to understand that the greatest challenge may not be withstanding cruelty, but navigating ambiguity without losing herself. By this stage, her emotional landscape has transformed. The rigid certainty she once relied upon has given way to a more fragile, questioning awareness. She is no longer simply enduring events. She is interpreting them, measuring their implications, and grappling with their contradictions. The war has shifted from an external struggle to an internal one, fought not with weapons but with perception and judgment. She remains wary, aware that restraint can be temporary and that history offers no guarantees. Yet she can no longer pretend that her expectations were accurate or sufficient. The enemy, as she encounters them, is neither the monster she feared nor the ally she might wish for. They are something more unsettling, human agents of a system that operates efficiently without overt brutality. This recognition marks a turning point, one that leaves her standing in a morally uncertain space, aware that the hardest battles ahead may be fought not against visible cruelty, but against the quiet normalization of control. The shift comes not through ideology or confrontation, but through the slow, relentless pressure of the environment itself. As weeks pass, the weather hardens, and the cold settles in with an indifference that mirrors the broader logic of the war. It does not discriminate between uniform and civilian clothing, between authority and submission. The cold seeps into buildings already weakened by neglect and damage, into bodies already strained by scarcity. It becomes a constant presence, shaping behavior more effectively than orders ever could. She feels it first in the mornings, when movement requires deliberate effort and breath emerges visibly in spaces that were once private and warm. The cold turns ordinary tasks into minor trials, each one demanding endurance rather than attention. In this physical discomfort, something subtle begins to change. The abstractions that once defined sides and roles lose their sharpness. Everyone is subject to the same unyielding conditions, forced into the same economy of energy and motion. The British, too, are affected. Their routines continue, but they are visibly shaped by the same constraints. Gloves are worn longer, movements become more economical, pauses more frequent. The uniform, once a symbol of authority, becomes just another layer against the cold, no more effective than the heavy coats worn by civilians. In this shared vulnerability, the power imbalance remains, but it is reframed. Authority no longer appears untouchable or insulated from hardship. It exists within the same physical limits as everyone else. She notices how the cold alters interactions. Voices lower, not out of secrecy, but out of conservation. Gestures become smaller, less expressive. There is a mutual understanding that unnecessary movement is wasteful. This unspoken agreement creates a strange sense of proximity, not emotional closeness, but situational alignment. Everyone is engaged in the same basic struggle to maintain warmth, to keep fingers functional, to endure the long hours of reduced light. This shared freezing does not erase resentment or fear, but it dilutes them. Anger requires energy, and the cold demands its own share. Hatred, once sustained by constant emotional readiness, now competes with more immediate concerns. She finds herself thinking less about moral positions and more about practical survival, where to stand to avoid drafts, how to layer clothing most effectively, when to move and when to remain still. These calculations are universal, crossing boundaries that once felt absolute. The environment asserts itself as the dominant force, relegating human conflicts to a secondary plane. The war, still present and still determining the structure of life, feels momentarily suspended beneath the weight of physical reality. In the face of cold that does not care who is right or wrong, ideological distinctions lose some of their urgency. Bodies respond to temperature, not to flags or orders. She becomes aware of how this shared hardship creates a quiet form of equality. Not equality of power or choice, but equality of exposure. The cold does not negotiate, does not adjust its severity based on status. It reaches everyone eventually, forcing the same compromises and adaptations. This realization unsettles her because it suggests a form of connection she has not chosen and does not entirely trust. Moments arise where this shared condition becomes visible. A brief pause as both sides wait out a gust of wind. A collective stillness as snow or frost intensifies. These are not gestures of solidarity, but acknowledgments of a common constraint. They carry no warmth in themselves, yet they soften the edges of hostility by reminding all involved of their physical limits. The freezing conditions also strip away illusion. Politeness becomes harder to maintain when fingers are numb and patience is thin. Restraint persists, but it is no longer effortless. She sees fatigue in faces that once appeared composed, hears strain beneath controlled voices. This does not provoke satisfaction or triumph. Instead, it deepens her understanding of the situation as one shaped not by individual intent alone, but by circumstances that press down on everyone indiscriminately. As the cold persists, it begins to redefine what endurance means. It is no longer about withstanding cruelty or asserting moral resilience. It becomes about persistence in the face of monotony and discomfort, about surviving not dramatic events but endless repetition. The war reveals another of its dimensions, not just violence and ideology, but attrition through environment and time. She feels herself growing quieter, not out of fear, but out of adaptation. The cold teaches economy, not only of movement but of thought. She thinks less expansively, focusing instead on immediate needs and manageable horizons. This narrowing of focus brings a strange clarity. The grand narratives that once dominated her imagination recede, replaced by a more grounded awareness of the present moment. In this state, the moral landscape shifts again. The gentleness she observed earlier now feels less surprising, less disruptive. It becomes part of a broader pattern in which human behavior is shaped as much by context as by character. The cold exposes how fragile performative harshness would be under such conditions. Excess cruelty would require energy that few can spare. Restraint, once interpreted as cultural or ethical, now appears also as practical. She does not romanticize this realization. The cold is not a teacher in the sentimental sense. It does not impart wisdom so much as impose limits. It shows her that human systems, even those built on domination, must adapt to physical reality. Power can command, but it cannot abolish winter. This truth reframes her understanding of authority, revealing its dependence on factors beyond ideology or will. The shared freezing also introduces a new form of tension. Proximity increases as people cluster in warmer spaces, yet trust does not follow automatically. The closeness is pragmatic, not chosen. It heightens awareness of others without necessarily fostering connection. She becomes acutely conscious of presence, of breath and movement in confined spaces, of the thin boundaries that separate individuals forced together by circumstance. In these moments, she feels the war most intensely as a condition rather than a series of events. It is not something that happens intermittently, but something that permeates daily existence, shaping even the most basic sensory experiences. The cold becomes a constant reminder that life has been reduced to essentials, that comfort is no longer assumed but negotiated day by day. She reflects on how this physical hardship alters memory. Dramatic moments blur, while repetitive discomfort sharpens. The cold etches itself into her awareness, becoming a reference point against which everything else is measured. Conversations, encounters, even fears are filtered through the question of warmth or lack thereof. This reordering of priorities feels both necessary and dehumanizing, stripping life down to survival metrics. Yet within this reduction, something unexpected emerges. The shared freezing creates a form of witness. She sees others enduring the same conditions, and they see her. There is no applause, no recognition, but there is an unspoken acknowledgement of persistence. This acknowledgement does not bridge political divides, but it complicates them, introducing a layer of shared experience that resists simple categorization. The cold also slows time. Days feel longer, nights heavier. Movement becomes deliberate, and waiting becomes a dominant activity. In this slowed rhythm, reflection becomes unavoidable. She finds herself thinking not only about what is happening, but about how it is happening, about the mechanisms that allow life to continue under such strain. These thoughts do not lead to conclusions, but they deepen her awareness of the war's pervasive reach. As winter deepens, the freezing conditions solidify into a backdrop that cannot be ignored. They bind everyone present into a single physical reality, one that does not care about allegiance or intent. In this reality, gentleness and harshness alike are tempered by necessity. The war, stripped of some of its ideological drama, reveals itself as a shared human ordeal, imposed unevenly but felt universally. She emerges from this period changed again, not softened, but recalibrated. The cold has taught her that endurance is not always heroic and that suffering does not always announce itself through violence. Sometimes it arrives quietly, settles in and stays. In this shared freezing, she begins to understand the war not just as a clash between nations, but as a condition that reduces everyone to their most basic capacities, forcing them to persist together even when nothing else is shared. As the weeks accumulate and the cold loosens its immediate grip, the deeper implications of what she has witnessed begin to surface. What once felt like isolated observations now coalesce into a more troubling understanding. The restraint she encountered was not an anomaly born of circumstance, nor merely a response to environmental hardship. It was structural, embedded in a system that knew how to function without constant displays of force. This realization carries a weight far heavier than fear. It suggests that power, when refined, does not need to announce itself loudly to be effective. She begins to see how order itself can become persuasive. The routines that govern daily life, permits, schedules, regulated movement, operate smoothly, almost invisibly. They demand compliance not through terror, but through repetition. Over time, resistance begins to feel impractical rather than heroic. The system does not ask her to agree with it, only to participate enough to keep life moving. This subtlety unsettles her more deeply than brutality ever could, because it implicates her in its functioning. Gentleness, she now understands, can coexist with dominance without contradiction. The absence of cruelty does not signal the absence of control. Instead, it refines control, making it less disruptive and therefore more sustainable. She recognizes how easily one can adapt to such conditions, how the human instinct for stability can override the impulse to resist. This awareness forces her to confront an uncomfortable truth. Survival does not always feel like defiance. Sometimes it feels like adjustment. She reflects on how her initial expectations had prepared her for visible suffering but not for moral ambiguity. She had believed that endurance would require emotional hardness, that cruelty would harden her against compromise. Instead, she finds herself facing a different test, one that challenges her internal boundaries rather than her physical resilience. The question is no longer how much pain she can withstand, but how much complexity she can carry without losing her sense of self. As she observes the system more closely, she notices how it rewards predictability. Those who follow routines are left largely undisturbed. Deviations are corrected not with rage, but with administrative precision. Punishment, when it comes, is procedural rather than personal. This impersonality strips conflict of its emotional clarity. There is no obvious villain to confront, no singular act of cruelty to anchor her anger. Instead, there is a network of rules that function efficiently regardless of individual intention. She becomes aware of how this structure diffuses responsibility. Each action is justified as part of a larger process, each decision framed as necessity rather than choice. This diffusion makes accountability difficult to locate. It also makes resistance harder to sustain, as there is no single point of pressure to push against. The system does not demand loyalty, but it benefits from acquiescence, and acquiescence becomes easier with each passing day. This realization leads her into a quiet internal struggle. She worries about what adaptation might cost her in the long term. If she learns to live within these constraints too comfortably, does she risk forgetting that they are unjust? If she accepts restraint as normal, does she contribute to its permanence? These questions do not have clear answers, and their persistence wears on her. She feels caught between the need to endure and the desire to remain morally alert. She notices subtle changes in herself. Her reactions are slower, less charged. Situations that once would have sparked immediate anger now register as inconveniences to be managed. This shift alarms her not because it feels imposed, but because it feels natural. The human capacity to normalize almost anything reveals itself as both a strength and a vulnerability. She recognizes how easily resilience can slide into accommodation without announcing the moment of transition. At the same time, she cannot deny the relief that comes from the absence of constant fear. The gentleness she once found destabilizing now offers a fragile sense of predictability. She sleeps more soundly, moves with less tension, and speaks with fewer rehearsed precautions. These changes are subtle, almost imperceptible, yet they signal a deeper transformation. Her body responds to reduced threat even as her mind struggles to interpret its meaning. This tension between bodily relief and moral unease becomes the defining feature of her experience. She feels safer, yet more conflicted. The war no longer appears solely as an external force imposed upon her, but as a condition she is learning to inhabit. This habitation feels dangerous precisely because it is quiet. There is no dramatic line marking the boundary between endurance and acceptance. She begins to think about the nature of complicity, a word she once associated with clear acts of betrayal or collaboration. Now it appears more diffuse, woven into daily routines and small concessions. She wonders whether participation in ordinary life under occupation constitutes a form of consent or whether survival itself is neutral. These thoughts do not accuse her, but they linger, demanding attention. The British gentleness, in this context, becomes morally ambiguous rather than reassuring. It is neither absolution nor deception, but a mode of governance that reveals how control can be exercised without spectacle. She understands now that cruelty is not the only tool of domination, and perhaps not even the most effective one. Restraint, when paired with consistency, can achieve compliance with less resistance and less disruption. This insight forces her to reconsider the stories she inherited about power and oppression.